Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar, our free webinar for the ICC, How Neuroscience is Transforming Coaching with Joseph O'Connor. Thank you for coming today. It's going to be a very interesting topic and a webinar to hear. And I would like to start by doing a little sound checkup. Could you please raise your hand on the app so you can let me know that you can hear me and that you can see the screen well? I'd like to see some hands risen. Thank you very much. Okay, I can see that you can hear me well. So, if at any point during the presentation you have any doubts, you want to make any comments, or you want to answer any of the trainers' questions, you can write them down on the question mark. That's the question panel. And all your questions and comments will be addressed at the right time. So without further ado, I'm going to leave you with Joseph O'Connor, who's going to be our speaker today. Joseph, thank you for being with us today, and welcome.
Hi, thanks very much. Hello, everybody. Welcome from a kind of wet and windy autumn day here in London. Got an interesting topic here, very interesting for me. Welcome to many names that I recognize in the list of those of you that are listening this morning. So some of you may already know neuroscience is a great interest for me now, especially with regard to coaching. It's something that is making a big difference to how we think about coaching and how we coach, of course. It has many practical implications. And the challenge for neuroscience, of course, is to take the sometimes rather academic findings of neuroscience, which is basically how the brain works, and translate those into something that we can use as coaches in order to understand our clients better and to help our clients better and to help our clients understand themselves better. So that's really what I'm very interested in. As some of you may know, I'm writing a book on exactly that, called Coaching and Neuroscience, how practical applications, coaching the brain, in fact. And we do a webinar course on this too. So this is a kind of one-off webinar, just as a kind of taster. We go for about 40-45 minutes. We'll have 10-15 minutes at the end for questions, and then wrap up. The stimulus as well for this webinar is, as you know, I'll be giving a coaching certification training in the wonderful magical island of Bali in Indonesia. Next April 2018. So I'm also hoping to whet your appetite for coaching and the kinds of new ways that we can think about coaching that I'll also be talking about more in that certification. So anyway, let's move on and get into this. How neuroscience is transforming coaching. I'm assuming that it is transforming coaching. I'm pretty sure it is. I'm following your scientific research, I'm following coaching research. I can see that more and more of the coaching books, articles, ideas, methods, models are starting to reference neuroscientific basis. So let's move to the next slide. So what is neuroscience? Well, this is the official definition: the study of the structure and function of the nervous system and brain and their relation to behavior and learning. In this webinar, certainly, and overall, we're going to concentrate on the brain, of course, because the brain is the main part of the nervous system. It's a part that's always changing. It's involved in everything we do. It's exactly what we take for granted as we go through life from our subjective experience of pleasure and pain and interest and attention and all those things that's life. And we look outside and we see, I'm looking outside now, I see beautiful trees and sky. I look around at my desk, I can hear myself talking, I can I am talking. I'm hoping that you're all listening. And I forget for the moment, and that's fine, that this is all created by my brain. I'm not saying there isn't a world outside. I'm simply saying that how I see it is created by my brain. And our brain creates everything, how we see the world, how we speak, what we hear, all of those things. And to ignore that part of us that's kind of really invisible, we don't think about it, and indeed, why should we? But to ignore it as coaches just seems ridiculous, because it is behind everything that we do. So then here's the brain, 100 billion cells, making a quadrillion connections. That's more than the number of atoms in the known universe, the connections. The brain is quite simply the most complicated thing that we can know about, that we can imagine, or maybe that we can imagine. And maybe we'll never understand it, because we're kind of pull ourselves up by our own shoelaces in order to do so. It's the brain trying to understand the brain, and I don't think it ever will completely. It's not conscious, it doesn't feel pain. It's that 3 pounds or so of kind of jelly-like buttery stuff that's in your skull, very well protected. Very small amount of your body weight, but takes 20% of your energy. In other words, it consumes the glucose in the blood, about 20% of it. It's very, very energy intensive, even when you're sleeping. In fact, sometimes even more when you're sleeping. The brain does not sleep. We sleep. The brain just does different things which we're not aware of. We used to think that once you were fully grown physically, then that was it, that your brain was complete, and nothing much happened after that. And we now know, fairly recently, in fact, 10 years, 12 years or so, that adult brains do grow new neurons. In fact, that is what happens. That's how we learn. That's how we develop. That's how the brain continues to change. If we were kind of stuck with the same brain, we really wouldn't be able to learn very much. But it does. And this is what is called neuroplasticity, which means that the brain can form and grow, make new connections, and indeed new neurons. There's plenty of research that shows that in human brains as well. Our ideas and our thinking.
Sorry, Joseph, sorry to interrupt, but the audio was lost for the last minute.
Okay, how did that happen?
I don't know. I haven't heard anything for the last minute, and apparently people also mentioned that they haven't heard anything in the last minute. So if you want to go back a point or two.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, it's okay now.
Okay, can everybody else hear me now?
Let's see. Yes. Okay, there are some people saying they didn't hear any minutes, so they've heard okay. So go on.
Okay, we lost a minute.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to carry on. I don't know what happened there. I didn't change anything. So just let me know if it happens again. Otherwise, I'm just going to continue. So I'm just going over this slide. Basically, you can read the things that there. I was saying that there's a huge number of connections in the brain, more than the number of atoms in the known universe. It's more complicated than we can imagine. Perhaps we'll never understand the brain. The brain's not conscious, we are. Consciousness seems to be something that arises out of the complexity of the brain and whatever else might be around for that to happen. I'm not going to stray into any kind of spiritual or religious areas here. The brain weighs about 3 pounds, very small weight compared with the rest of the body, but it takes a lot of energy, even when you're sleeping. In fact, the brain is more energetic and more active sometimes when you're sleeping than when you're awake. The most important point that I was saying is that adult brains do grow new nerve cells. And this is quite a recent discovery in terms of neuroscience, about 10, 12 years. It used to be thought that when we were physically mature, when our bodies had finished growing, so had the brain, and that was it. You didn't get any new nerve cells. In fact, the mythology was that you lost nerve cells as you got older, until you ended up, the older you were, the less nerve cells you had, which is a complete myth. We do grow new neurons all the time. It's how we learn. We make new connections, otherwise we couldn't learn. So that continues to happen. We make the new nerve cells, we make the new connections, and that's normal. And what's particularly interesting for me is that these nerve cells and these connections, they're real material things. They have weight. You could see them under a microscope. They are part of the material world. And thought is not. Thought is not part of the material world. You can't weigh thought, as far as I know. It has no material aspect. And yet, our thinking can have, and does have, impact on the number of neurons that we make and the new connections that we make. So something that immaterial, thought, affects the material aspect of the brain. And of course it goes the other way. Once these new connections are made, they also affect your thinking. So it's a bit like making a path in the road. As you think more in one way, it kind of makes a groove. It makes that road bigger. It's like going across the jungle in a particular way. And more people, and the more times you go across that jungle, the more you beat out the path until there is a path there, and that's where you're going to go from then on. You don't go into the jungle on either side because you've got a path. So just as our thinking makes new pathways, so the new pathways then tend to constrain our thinking to those pathways, and this is how we get habits of action and habits of thinking. It's also true that not only does the brain develop as we get older, but some parts of the brain are actually not mature until our 60s. A lot of the brain is not mature until mid-20s, which explains the impulsiveness of teenagers and young adults, as opposed to the less impulsiveness of older people. And that's part of how the brain works, just how it is. Okay, so again, making this distinction between the brain and how we perceive. Brains don't have likes or dislikes, rewards or punishments. You do. That's probably not quite true. The brain has particular pathways that it follows that are then translated into pleasure and rewards in our world. But in itself, it doesn't. Brains are material and they can go wrong. And if they go wrong, then our subjective experience goes wrong. As we know, when people have a stroke or brain damage in some way, it can profoundly change their personality. And we'll get onto that in a little while. Thinking is normally biased and illogical and is affected by events and experiences that we are not aware of. We often think that we can be very logical and objective, and it's pretty clear now that we're not at all, and that our thinking and the way that we think is pretty biased. and we can't really help that. It's not our fault, as it were. It's just the way things are. And so it's good to know that. It's good to know that there are biases. It's good to know that there are influences in our environment that are going to affect the way that we think, and not so that we don't pretend that we can be completely objective, because we can't. Most of what we do is not under our conscious control, and that's, again, quite obvious. Here we are, our heart is beating, we're breathing, I'm digesting my breakfast, and I have absolutely no conscious control over that whatsoever. That's fairly straightforward. And if you were to do a little experiment, or maybe some of you do meditate, and you sit down quietly and you aim to keep your mind free of thoughts for a minute, let's say just 1 minute, 60 seconds. Now, if you've tried this, you'll know that you can't. You know that you have no control over the types of, not only you have no control over the fact that thinking is going to happen anyway, nor do you have very much control over what thoughts pop into your head. If you haven't done this experiment, I strongly suggest you do it. Just take a minute to clear your mind and try and think of nothing. And you'll be amazed at what comes into your head. All sorts of weird and wonderful things about what happened years ago, what happened yesterday, what you want to do today, what plans you have for tomorrow. It seems almost random. So we don't control our brain. And there's no point in thinking that we do. We can direct it and we can use what we get. As they say, we have trains of thought, but we don't have to ride on those trains. We can choose which trains we ride on, but we cannot control the trains that come. So just mentioning that brains are embodied. In other words, they are part of us physically, and if something happens to them, then it can change what we think is our personality. There's something called a gourmand syndrome. A gourmand, as you probably know, is someone who is very, very appreciative of fine food, loves fine food. And there's a particular part of the right frontal lobe of the brain, what's called the prefrontal cortex, which is at the front forehead. And the most famous case of this was a Swiss political journalist, aged about late 40s. And he had a stroke. In other words, there was part of his brain, the blood supply to part of his brain was disrupted for a moment, and part of his brain, the cells died. And he was okay after that, but he became a columnist for fine dining. In other words, he became a gourmand. He got really interested to the point of obsession about very fine food. And this is not a coincidence, because there have been a number of cases of people who've had injury or stroke to that particular part of the brain, and they all get really, really interested in fine food. Now, this seems very odd. Why on earth do they get interested in fine food? We have no idea, but we do know that something like that, something of an interest that we think would be very much personal and subjective, can be turned on by an injury to one particular part of the brain. And in the past, what we discovered about the brain was actually discovered mostly through injuries from people. So people would have injuries to a particular part of the brain. Doctors would notice what happened as a result of that. The speech was disturbed, or they couldn't recognize faces, or the personality was changed, like in the gourmand syndrome, and they were able to at least get some idea about what parts of the brain controlled what parts of the personality, at least what the link was. And the most famous case was a man called Phineas Gage. He was a railroad worker in the United States, in Boston. And in 1848, so that's about 150, 160 years ago, they were blasting out the railroad through the United States, and they used to put the lines in, the metal bars in, by tapping in explosives and then blowing out some of the rock, and then they were able to lay the rails. And he was doing that. So he used to tap in the powder, and then he used to detonate it, making sure he was far away. And this is what he was doing, basically. He was quite a normal guy. He used to tap in the powder with a metal pole, and one day he was doing that, and the pressure that he did wrongly set off the explosion, and the metal pole, which was about 1 inch across and about 1 meter long, was blown upwards, and it went through the side of his face, and you can see his disfigurement there. It shattered his jaw, it went through the back of his left eye and out through the top of his head, and it hit the ground 25 meters away. That's a metal pole 1 meter in length and 1 inch across. Now, you would expect this guy to be dead, but not only was he alive, but he didn't even lose consciousness, nor did he have any pain. As we know, the brain doesn't feel pain. The body may feel pain, but when we have an injury, the brain produces what's called endorphins, which kind of dull the pain, natural painkillers. Anyway, he was still conscious, and he was taken to hospital, and they patched him up as best they could in 1848. And 2 months later, apart from the injuries that you can see to his face, he seemed to be okay. He functioned normally. He was still intelligent. He could talk, but he was now extremely angry and aggressive. He would swear at everybody. He was abusive. He was impulsive. He gambled. He wasted money. He didn't care about himself or his family. And this was the complete opposite of his personality before, where people said he was a very good worker, he was a good family man. So he was clearly, as they said, not himself. So I think what's really interesting about those two cases is that one very, very, very small change can make a change in the personality. And at the same time, you can have a huge injury to the brain. And yes, it will make a huge change to your personality, but it doesn't necessarily kill you, and it will leave a lot of your faculties intact. The brain is very much divided. It's a bit like an iPad with a series of apps. You can take out or delete an app, and it won't affect the other apps. It'll just mean you don't have that particular one. That's a kind of general metaphor in the way that the brain works. This is, I think, a wonderful quote, and what makes it interesting for me. This comes from William James, the American psychologist. He says, "Nature, in her unfathomable designs, had mixed clay and flame of my brain and mind, and the two hang indubitably together and determine. But how or why, no mortal man may ever know." Well, maybe this was written about 100 years ago. Well, since then, perhaps we know a lot more, and we can know a lot more. But still, the mystery of how the brain, the material, gives rise to the thought, the flame, and how the flame affects the material is, well, the biggest problem, not only in neuroscience, but also in philosophy, spirituality, and everything else. We have no idea. But I think that understanding the brain better will bring us closer to that, without claiming in any way that once you understand the brain, you can then explain away consciousness or spirituality or anything like that. I don't think anybody's claiming that. But what we are saying is the more that you understand about the clay, what gives rise to the flame, the more you can understand the flame. Now, so what about coaching then? The coach changes the client's subjective experience. And our subjective experience is about values, of course, about our goals, about our ideas and beliefs. And when we look into neuroscience, we can see how values are driven by emotions, which neuroscience will give us an understanding of. We can understand habits of thinking, habits of action, how they're formed in the brain and have to be changed in the brain. It can help us to understand about goals, about what's needed in order to both formulate our goals, to motivate ourselves to get these goals, to understand and sequence actions in order to get the goals. So how do you coach the brain? Well, a coach in this definition, or at least idea, at the bottom here, is a facilitator of self-directed neuroplasticity. Well, what does this mean? It means, first of all, the coach is a facilitator. In other words, they help. Facilitator means someone who helps. The coach does not do anything directly, as we know. They don't give advice, they don't tell you, they help the client think for themselves. Self-directed, so the client does it themselves, and the neuroplasticity is how the brain changes itself. So at the end of coaching sessions, the client will be behaving, we hope, differently, thinking differently, and that will be paralleled in their brain by changes in the number of neurons and changes in the connections between neurons that have been laid down, or some have been pruned away, in order to make that change in behavior. The two go together. So this is what a coach is doing. A coach is actually changing your brain. So there we have neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity converts experience into neurons. I think it's an amazing idea. You have experience, it's converted in real time into connections and neurons in your brain, which then reflects your experience, which then allows you perhaps to have more experience, or it may constrain you and lead you down particular paths, and you don't then explore other paths. So neuroplasticity it has a dark side too. It's the way that we learn, and it's absolutely important and necessary. However, it also means that once you form habits, they are hard to change, as we all know, because not only is it about our experience of, we don't think anymore about doing anything else, but that's what's happened in our brain. The neuroplastic changes in the brain have actually laid down those patterns, and that becomes the easy road to travel. He was a neuroscientist, lived about 50 years ago, and his law is expressed in what fires together wires together. It's not exactly how he said it, but it's a bit more catchy than how he said it. And what it means is that when two neurons fire together, one leads to the other, then they are more likely to fire together in future, because there's starting to make a kind of connection between the two. So as you string together your thoughts, so every time you have the same thought, those neurons, the connection between the neurons is strengthened, and it's more likely to follow that path of less resistance in future, until in the end you have a habit. You don't think about doing any other path because that path is laid down. And in order to change that habit, you have to not only dismantle the connection that's been made, but make a new one. But that's what's the law, as it were, behind it. What makes neuroplasticity possible? Well, repetition, of course. We know that in order to change and to build habits, you need to repeat. Surprise helps, certainly. Surprise it's an emotion, and it's something that, because it startles us and leads to production of certain brain chemicals that make neuroplasticity more likely and easier. You need certain proteins and brain chemicals for neuroplasticity to happen. One of them is called dopamine, which is a neurotransmitter, which means that it simply links two neurons together. And surprise is one thing that leads to an increase in dopamine. So these things make neuroplasticity possible. And as part of coaching, we need to be aware of this. We can utilize them as well. And most important of all, attention. To pay attention. I used to work as a guitar teacher. I used to teach people in the classical guitar, used to train concert guitarists, and I knew that a musician who practices for half an hour paying attention to what they're doing is going to improve far more than a musician that plays 2 hours without paying a lot of attention to what they're doing. So it's not just about repetition, it's about focused attention when you repeat. Okay, there's a couple of other things as well that are worth saying at this stage too. Once you get into neuroscience, you start to understand, because the brain is embodied, it's part of your body, there are some very important physical things that help the brain to be healthy and to work well. One of them is exercise. Exercise does increase the production of new nerve cells, but interestingly enough, only if you do it voluntarily. In other words, if somebody makes you exercise, you don't get the production of new nerve cells. But if you do the exercise because you want to do it, it does. And I think that's extremely interesting. And the other thing, of course, is sleep. And the brain needs to sleep. And if the brain doesn't get sleep, then it goes haywire, as we know. It needs not only the rest of certain parts of sleep, but it also needs the dreaming part of sleep too, in order to consolidate its memories and experience of the day. So exercise and sleep are two things, obvious things, really, of course. But once you go into how the brain works and a bit about neuroscience, you start to understand how very important these are for everybody. And at least for me, it's made me think much more about the physical aspects of coaching in terms of physical habits to help people to work better. You know, with an executive that comes complaining if they can't pay attention and they're not working very well and they're under stress, sure, we can help a lot with setting goals, with sorting out values, with helping them to look at their beliefs and habits and ideas. And probably it won't make a lot of difference if they're only getting 3 hours sleep a night. That has to be addressed, and I think as coaches sometimes we don't pay enough attention to that. We think maybe it's something to do with doctors or sports coaches or something like that, but I don't think so, not anymore. Okay, so now I want to introduce you to at least one thing in terms of thinking, because as coaches We help people to think better. We help people to get new perspectives. We help them to make new distinctions. We help them to clarify their goals. And one thing that's very clear in terms of how the brain works is that we kind of have two systems of thinking. So we get the input from the environment, and we get a response, a thought, saying something. And there are two systems, and this kind of system one and system two comes from Daniel Kahneman's work as a behavioral economist. You may have heard about or read his book with Amos Tversky called Thinking. I think it's called Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow, and basically looking at how people think in real life, because certainly up to that point, economists thought that everybody acted as a perfectly rational agent. They made decisions based on rationality and objectivity completely, and this is how they made economic forecasts. No wonder that economic forecasts haven't been accurate ever, because people don't think like that. So two systems of thinking, system one fast, system two slow. And system one fast is what we it's kind of like habits of thinking. It's like what we jump to. It's kind of where we go when we don't think, as it were. System two is much more reflective and analytical. System one is fast, it's unconscious, it's immediate, it's based on parts of the brain, one called the insula and the other called the anterior cingulate cortex, which is part of the brain that kind of curls around the prefrontal cortex. And system two is more slow, more conscious, more analytical, based much more on the prefrontal cortex, that part of the brain behind, or on the forehead, behind the eyebrows. And generally speaking, we go into system one, especially when we're tired, when we're stressed, when we're drunk. System one takes over, and it doesn't do very well. It has a number of biases and difficulties that we'll go into. And the first, and now we're describing system one, which is how we are likely to think without a more slower, reflective take on what we're doing. And the first is loss aversion. And this means that people strongly resist losses more than they want to gain a reward. In other words, people hate losing more than they love winning. So people will tend to take a guaranteed gain if there's one around rather than risk losing. But when they're looking at a loss, they're more likely to take a big gamble. You know, like a gambler that's just lost money. Well, they don't like that, so they want to gain it back, so it's double or quits. Then, you gamble again, and if you win, then you get the money back. And if you lose double. So we don't like losing. And one way that this comes out is what's called sunken costs fallacy. Sunken costs means that when you've put time or effort or money into something, we do not like to lose it, and we tend to persist with that, even when it's pretty stupid to do so. So the classical example of that is you go to a film, for example. You're looking forward to this film, you think it's going to be good, you expect it to be good, you pay your money, you sit down, and after about 5-10 minutes, you realize this film is a turkey. This film is terrible. This film is boring. I don't want to be here. Now, a lot of people will continue to sit through that film because they paid. They say, well, I paid for it, then I'm gonna have it. Might as well stay. And the fallacy there, of course, is that they've already lost their money, unless they go and ask for their money back. They've already lost their money, so that's gone. Why waste time on top of that? Which is what they're doing. So in the same way with the stock market, you buy some shares, they go down. Most people think, well, I better hang on and get the money back. Now that I've paid that, I might as well try and hang on, not realizing that they've lost that money. And in order not to lose more, maybe it's time to get out. So this happens a lot in business. You put time, you put effort, you put money into something, and then you have an emotional and quite unreasonable investment in keeping on with it, even though you know, or you at that point, you're losing out. And this is part of what's called a status quo bias, which is people prefer to stay with the known than risk going to the unknown. So what basically people think is that the status quo, what you have now, is a reference point, and any change is looked at as a loss. It's perceived as a loss. So it's a bit like a loss aversion. Now, of course, this is not rational. And some thinking about this, you think, well, no, of course that's not right. But what I'm saying is that this is how the brain works when we don't think about our thinking. This is what we're likely to go into. And what it means in practice for coaches is that people will resist decisions to change, even if the transition cost is small and the decision is important. They will resist that change simply because it is a change, because there is this emotional bias towards staying where you are. And this is one thing that makes change quite difficult. So we have that bias. Sometimes this is referred to as people are cognitive misers. We don't like making an effort to think. We resist efforts of thinking. We fall back on habitual thinking. There's a classic kind of puzzle here that I'll just explain to you. It's called the bat and ball puzzle, and it's a typical example of how we think when we don't think. So here's a little maths problem. So you've got a bat and a ball, and together they cost $1.10. Okay, and the bat costs $1 more than the ball. So together they cost $1.10, and the bat costs $1 more than the ball costs. And the question is, what does the ball cost? And I'll leave you with that, and maybe we'll pick it up at the end. Attentional bias, blindness, we notice and pay attention to things that matter to us and that we're thinking about, and we don't notice important information. So we're distracted by basically what we're preoccupied with. And there's a little picture here, which I'm sure many of you have seen. There's a very famous video. It's on the internet, the gorilla in the room. So this was a experiment conducted many years ago. And basically the instruction was you had to watch these 6 people throw a ball around, and it started off with them throwing the ball around, and you had to count the number of times that the people in the black shirts caught the ball. So you had a task to do. So this is what was important, and that's what you were looking out for. And then halfway through the video, it only lasted a minute, this gorilla, so someone in a gorilla suit, wanders across and wanders out the other side. And what's amazing is that about half of people don't see it. They do not see the gorilla, even though you can even track their eye movements. They're looking right at it. They don't see it because they're distracted by the task. That is amazing when it's put like that, but we know that our interests make us not see things when we're interested in something else. Survivor bias is another one. Winning makes you visible, losing makes you invisible. So in other words, you don't see the losses, you don't see the people who failed, you only see the stars, you only see the film stars, you only see the pop stars, the musicians that make it, you only see the novelists that make it, you only see the Steve Jobs and the top business people that make it. And what you don't see is, for every one of those people, the thousands of people that didn't make it. Therefore, we totally overestimate our chances of success because we're not taking into account the failures. We're paying attention to a very selective data set, only the winners. So we make huge overestimations of our chance of succeeding. Another one or two. This is called the swimmer's body illusion. It's the difference between what causes something and what goes together with something. In other words, people think that if you swim, you're going to get a body like that. But that's not true. Good swimmers swim well because they have a body like that. You know, they have that sort of body. Of course, it can get a bit more muscle in it, but generally speaking, it's the swimming that develops that body. It's not the swimming that gives you that body. So we mistake selection factors for results. We generally mistake what's called correlation with causation. In other words, we see two things together and we think one causes the other. But that's not true. Either there's no connection, or maybe there's a third thing that causes both. There's a very famous website actually that has a number of these very funny connections. One of them I remember is that there's a very, very strong connection between the number of movies that Nicolas Cage brings out and the number of drownings every year. And you can plot this. Nicolas Cage is an actor that does a lot of movies. So it's plotted, you can see it on the website. The number of movies Nicolas Cage brings out against the number of drownings. It follows almost exactly. And, you know, therefore you think, oh, well, hold on, Nicolas Cage movies cause people to drown themselves? Well, I don't think so. Unless there's a third possibility that could explain both, the odds are that there is absolutely no connection between that at all. It's just a coincidence, and there are many coincidences that happen. It's like the old thing about, oh, I was just thinking of you and then you phoned. How amazing. I must have been able to call you up somehow telepathically. And of course, what that means is that we pay attention to the one time when you happen to be thinking of this person, they happen to call you. And we disregard the thousands of times when you were thinking of this person and they didn't call you. So it's just a coincidence. There's nothing else to it. Okay. Well, I've certainly done 3/4 of an hour. There's quite a bit more that I could have talked about. I wanted to talk a little bit about emotion, but we won't have time for that. I think what comes out of this, at least for me, is that the brain is an amazing part of us, that it's embodied, that we need to take care of it physically, that it works in ways that we do not know or understand and can trick us in many ways that we don't see, and that the more we understand about it, the better it's going to be for us as coaches. I just want to go through here. Yeah, there's one thing here. The brain is a storyteller. The brain makes things fit together. It looks for patterns. It tells ourselves stories to make sense of the events. We find it no pattern. So it's worth thinking about our brain as a storyteller, our brain that spins together events in the best way that we can and comes up with stories. And can we help our client not only to be a better storyteller, to take into account better things, but can we get them to tell a better story. And here's just one little optical illusion. This is just one very clear way that our brain deceives us, not just in thinking, but even, as they say, seeing is believing. Well, there's an optical illusion. You can see square A and square B. And if you look at that, as I look at that, square A looks considerably darker than square B. And I think we'd all agree about that. That's the way our eyes work. That's the way our brain interprets what we see. And yet, A and B are the same color. Okay, they are the same color. But the way that our brain interprets the play of light and shadow in those squares means that we interpret those colors to be very different when in fact they're not. And this is a good metaphor for many ways that we think. So, okay, I'm going to go on to questions. So if anybody has any questions or comments, we have a little time here at the end to bring those up. And as I say, what I'm trying to do here is to expand our coaching, how we think about coaching, by taking into account something that hasn't got very much into coaching so far, but will considerably more, which is our brain and neuroscience. And the more we understand about that, the better coaches we will be. It's a great interest of mine, and certainly when I do the coaching certification training in Bali in April, and Bali is a wonderful, wonderful place, I'm going to be talking about that as well. So over to you guys. Comments, questions about what I've said so far, which is really just scratching the surface of the brain, if you'll forgive a rather painful metaphor. Sorry, no, the brain doesn't have pain, so we're okay.
Yes, Joseph, there are a couple of questions so far. Pedro is asking, can attention deficiency syndrome affect the neuroplasticity of the brain?
Well, neuroplasticity is what happens in the brain anyway. It's absolutely a natural process. Attention deficit disorder is something that's quite complicated, and there can be different. It's a kind of overall diagnosis, but it can be caused by all sorts of different things, and there are different sorts of attention deficit disorder. The most common attention deficit disorder is caused by the prefrontal cortex unable to inhibit other parts of the brain. So the way to help people who have attention deficit disorder is to actually stimulate the prefrontal cortex so that it inhibits other part of the brain. Now, this may seem really weird, because if you think about attention deficit disorder, you normally think about kids running around, not paying attention to anything and causing trouble, jumping on desks. And you would think, well, the last thing they want is more stimulation. But in fact, the medication for that is a stimulant. You stimulate the prefrontal cortex part of the brain to inhibit the behavior that's happening because of other parts of the brain. And of course, also ADHD is not just about kids. There are plenty of adults that suffer from it, and there's plenty of undiagnosed cases of ADHD when people think that they're impulsive or stupid or not able to pay attention or hyper-focused, because it can go the other way. People can be so focused on something that they pay absolutely no attention to anything else, and then people start complaining. That's another possibility in ADHD. It needs more prefrontal cortex. Now, in terms of neuroplasticity, yes, because in cases of ADHD where you treat it with drugs, what that can do then is to bring in the prefrontal cortex more, stimulate the prefrontal cortex more, that then can link in with those parts of the brain, mostly around the basal ganglia and limbic system, which is the emotional part of the brain, more deeper in the brain. Because there are connections between the two, and to help the prefrontal cortex take more control about that, and that can lead to stronger connections between the prefrontal cortex and the basal ganglia, and that again of course is part of neuroplasticity. So the answer is yes, it can, but remember, neuroplasticity is a general principle of the brain, whereas ADHD is a more kind of diagnosis of certain things that can then happen in the brain that's, let's say, not optional. What else?
There's another question. Rajiv asks, can you explain Hebb's law once more with an example?
Well, Hebb's law, what fires together wires together. Okay, so think about the brain as a series of neurons, which are nerve cells, with a kind of track where the electrical impulse flows. And it flows down this track, and then it comes to a gap. And in order to continue to flow, it needs to jump the gap. And in order to jump the gap, there needs to be certain chemicals that are made in the gap called neurotransmitters that bridge the gap. Then the electrochemical signal from the nerve can jump the gap and continue on down, because apart from very few neurons which connect to the spinal cord, neurons are quite short. They need to be able to jump the gap. So in that sense, the metaphor would be that the nerve impulse travels down, and then it comes to a synapse, a gap. The neurotransmitter is produced, it jumps the gap, and it continues. Now, that makes it more likely that when that signal comes down again, that the neurotransmitter will be produced and the signal will jump the gap again. The more that happens, the more likely that it will be that it's going to happen, until in the end it'll happen every time, because it's always probabilistic, you know, whether signals jump the gap or not. There's always a probability. So you can start with a very small probability, and then the more it does it, the bigger the probability is that it's going to jump next time. So that means that when after a while, you're going to have a habit of thinking. In other words, when you think of, to give a silly example, when you think of a blue pen, you immediately think of a credit card. I'm just taking two things on my desk. So you're making a connection because you've done it so many times, perhaps paying attention a lot of times, and you make these connections. And we all have our own little connections that we've made between thinking of certain things and then always jumping to something else. You know, we say, it reminds me of, whenever I see this picture, it reminds me of this. That's neuroplasticity, it's Hebb's law. So Hebb's law is really the neuroscientific explanation in material terms, in terms of nerve cells and neurotransmitters and synapses, of what happens when we say, oh, whenever I think of this, that reminds me of that. Yeah, that's how it works. If you want to find out exactly what Hebb's law means, you know, look up the neuroscience on Google, and you'll get, I guarantee, more than you need about electrochemical synapses.
All right. Joseph? Sorry, Joseph.
Anybody there?
The audio.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Have you finished the question? The answer, sorry.
Yeah.
Okay, good. I think we have time for one question.
Yeah, one or two more.
Um, and there's a question. It says, can you talk about a few examples of how this information can be used in methods of leadership development coaching?
Leadership development coaching. Well, wow. Okay, that's a big subject in itself. What are you, when you're developing leaders, what are you trying to develop? Well, you're trying to develop their communication skills, for sure. So then you are going to have, this was going to help you to clarify their thinking in terms of how they think. It's going to help them to explain to others, and also, which we didn't touch on at all, but which is very important, of course, the empathy and emotion with which we connect with other people, and how that works, and how we can connect with other people. There is another aspect that we haven't touched on, but it's very interesting and important, around motivation, and how we motivate ourselves and how that works. So how do you motivate yourself as a leader? Because if you don't motivate yourself, how are you going to motivate anybody else? And how will you then motivate other people? How will you be able to tap into their values and their sense of motivation in order to lead them? In other words, they want to follow you. There are many people say that what a leader does is they create a story. They create a story that other people buy into. Just like a best-selling novelist, you create a good story that other people want to believe, that they're willing to help you to co-create. So again, we're looking at the brain as a storyteller. We're looking about patterns. We're looking about what patterns can a leader see and what patterns can they latch onto. We're talking about leaders need to represent other people, other people's interest. They need to find out what other people's interests are. They need to work well with other people in terms of teams. They need to have some kind of vision, some kind of story that other people can buy into. And they need to take action based on that. So I think that another thing we haven't touched on is decision making. How do we decide? What sort of elements do we bring into our decisions that's going to help us to make the best possible decision? These are all neuroscientific topics. They're all part of what a leader needs to do, and or a manager as well. And also, a leader has this extra dimension of motivating, stimulating, making other people want to follow them, want to help them to create a future, a reality that they can buy into. So it's always an interesting gap, because when we're talking neuroscience and the brain, this is quite material, yeah. And when we talk about the brain, we can talk about quite specific connections and quite specific parts of the brain. When we talk about leadership, we're talking about something extremely abstract, which a lot of people won't even agree on what the definition is. But we can say, I think, that usually people will agree that leaders need certain skills. And I think that understanding how the brain works and an understanding of neuroscience is going to help a leader to understand themselves better, to know themselves, which is always the first step, to understand other people and what motivates them better, which is the second step. And leadership coaching, same thing goes, for coaches to understand how to help leaders to think better, to make better decisions, to connect better with people, based on not what we hope will happen, not what we think should happen, but what actually happens in the brain.
All right. Then
One more question.
one more question.
Yeah.
there's one more. It says, it's the quality of attention that impacts on the way neuroplasticity functions. What kind of
Hmm.
connections are created?
Sorry, what kind of what are created?
What kind of connections?
What? Oh, whatever you're attending to. The brain is indiscriminate in that way. If you attend to nonsense, you'll make connections that will be nonsense. You know, if you attend to something important, you'll make connections between that will reinforce that importance. It all depends what you pay attention to. Attention is one of those amazing things that, again, is really hard to define. And again, you can't weigh it. It's not material, and yet it strongly affects what connections get made. So if I want to really study and understand this paperclip that I'm looking at right now, I can pay it exquisite attention, and that's going to reinforce the memory of it, the meaning of it, perhaps, and perhaps even the emotional value of it if I make connections with the life of this paperclip. But this paperclip is trivial. I don't need to pay that any attention whatsoever. If I do, we'll make plenty of connections. Or I can pay attention to this photograph of Andrea, which is beautiful and very meaningful. And the more I pay attention to it, the more important it becomes. So I become more connected in that way. So that's the simple answer to that. You'll make connections with what you pay attention to. So beware of what you pay attention to. Or pay attention to what you pay attention to. So I think we can wind it up there.
Okay. Just a quick
Thank you all very much.
just a quick comment before you close up, Joseph.
Mm-hmm.
If you want to join Joseph's training in Bali, please contact info@nlpinstitute.co.id for more information about Joseph's training in Bali. And now, Joseph, thank you for being here and thank you for the webinar. It was very good.
Okay, thank you, everybody. Thanks, Alexis. I think it's a really interesting topic. If you're interested in the certification training in Bali, contact, as Alexis says, Irene directly, or of course you can always contact ICC, which is easier to remember, and we'll put you in touch. And I also have a coaching in neuroscience series of webinar trainings that will be coming up shortly. If you're interested in that, again, contact the ICC.
Yes.
Thank you all very much in your different time zones.
Yes, and have a good day to everyone. And you'll be receiving the recording very soon. Bye bye.
Okay. Thanks very much. Bye bye.